Good morning. My name is Nancy Ryan. I wanted to welcome you all to our presentation, How Sweet It Is Managing Our Diabetes. I am the inpatient diabetes coordinator at Greenwich Hospital, and I'll be your presenter this morning. And I wanted to thank the Regional Community Health Improvement Partnership of Fairfield and Westchester counties, and also our organizers of the meeting today, Kathy Carly Spanier, who is the Director of Community Health at Greenwich Hospital, and Deborah Travers, who's the Director of Family Health at the Greenwich Department of Health. Also, I want to thank our technical support, Albert Casano, who is the Yale New Haven Health System Audio Video Services contact person, and Gino Piri, who is from the Community Health at Greenwich Hospital. So I wanted to thank them both for their help in setting this up. So I will begin by putting on our slides. And what I would like to do today is go through what diabetes is and some things that we can do to manage our diabetes. So very simplistically, I put diabetes is the inability for the body to make insulin or use insulin. And so insulin being a tiny protein, our pancreas makes it, and it helps control our blood sugars as well as having a few other functions. So generally, we talk about two main types of diabetes, although there are variations. But I just wanted to review very quickly the two types that are typically discussed. Type 1 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes, we oftentimes associate that with diabetes that first is discovered in children, that we see it being diagnosed in a pediatric population. This is a type of diabetes where the body is no longer able to produce any insulin. So if it's an autoimmune disease, meaning that for some reason the body's own immune system is triggered and it destroys the cells in the pancreas that make insulin. And so there's no insulin production. It can happen at any age, which is sometimes surprising to people because it is an autoimmune disease. It can occur up until our 90s. And so while the incidence is much more frequent in a pediatric population, we do see it in people who are in their 60s, 70s, and 80s as well. Less frequent, but it does happen. And for type 1 diabetes, the only treatment is to replace the insulin. So one has to take insulin either by a syringe or an insulin pen or an insulin pump. So type 2 diabetes is that type 1 and type 2 diabetes share some characteristics, but they're really two different disorders. Type 2 diabetes is the far more prevalent type of diabetes. Between 90 and 95% of people who have diabetes have a diagnosis of type 2 diabetes. And we know that in addition to genetics, lifestyle can also play a role in the development of type 2 diabetes. So there are risk factors associated with how we eat and how we move. And because of that, the treatment includes eating well, making good food choices, being physically active, and if our doctor prescribes medications, taking those medications as prescribed. So this morning, we're going to talk primarily about type 2 diabetes. There are many similarities in the management between type 1 and type 2 diabetes, but I'm really going to concentrate on type 2 diabetes. So when we talk about prevalence, in the United States, the CDC, the Center for Disease Controls, has estimated over 34 million Americans have a diagnosis of diabetes. So if you're in a room of 10 people, at least one person in that room, more likely than not, has diabetes. And what can be a little frightening is that 1 in 5 people who have diabetes, they don't know that they have it. So it can be a very silent disease. I didn't want to not include prediabetes. Prediabetes, 88 million people in the United States it's been estimated, have prediabetes. I wanted to mention this because many times when I talk to people who have a diagnosis of prediabetes, the importance of that is somewhat minimized, and prediabetes very frequently can go on to develop into type 2 diabetes. And also some of the potential complications from diabetes are starting to get a toehold in the 10 or so years prior to the diagnosis of diabetes. And that's the period that we call a pre-diabetes period. So it's not an innocuous diagnosis. It is something that needs to be addressed, just as a diagnosis of diabetes needs to be addressed. So who's at risk of developing type 2 diabetes? Age has something to do with this. From the age of 45 years or older, our doctors will be monitoring our blood work to see if we have diabetes. So as the calendar progresses, we start to look for diabetes. A family history. It's very common for people to say that they have members of their immediate family who have also been diagnosed with diabetes. And sometimes people will say, well, no one in my family has ever had diabetes. Sometimes that's because it hadn't been diagnosed, and we just saw that 1 in 5 people have it and they haven't been diagnosed. And also sometimes people just didn't discuss it. They didn't talk about it. So, and also we can be the first person on the family tree to develop diabetes. So family history can play a role. Also, ethnicity and race can play a role. So there are certain populations who are at increased risk of developing type 2 diabetes. These are people in the Latinx population, African Americans, Native Americans. Their risk of developing type 2 diabetes tends to be high. Another risk factor, and one that is something that is controllable, is our weight. So if we're overweight or obese, that does increase the risk of developing type 2 diabetes. And when I think about weight, what I'm really thinking about is what's been called belly fat, or fat that's deep within our abdomen. When we gain weight and we're gaining fat around our middle, for years and years, it was thought, well, it just sits there and it doesn't do anything except make our clothes a little tighter. But actually, that fat that's deep within our abdomen, it actually produces hormones. Just like our thyroid produces hormones and our pancreas makes hormones, that belly fat makes hormones as well. And when we increase the amount of belly fat, there's a shift in the kinds of hormones that it produces. And this increases the risk not only of type 2 diabetes, but also high blood pressure and high cholesterol. So weight plays a significant role in the development of type 2 diabetes. Another potential risk factor, again, that we can modify is our physical activity. So individuals who lead a sedentary lifestyle, they're at increased risk of developing type 2 diabetes. And we all probably are aware that the less we move, the easier it is to gain weight. So these two, overweight and sedentary lifestyle, can walk hand in hand towards increasing risk for type 2 diabetes. And the last risk factor that I wanted to mention, women who have had gestational diabetes during a pregnancy are at higher risk of developing type 2 diabetes. And sometimes a woman may have given birth to a baby that weighs 9 pounds or more. They weren't diagnosed with type 2 with gestational diabetes, but because of the large size of the baby, that confers an increased risk of developing type 2 diabetes. And I'd like to be mindful that having a risk doesn't necessarily, this is inevitable, because there are things that I can do to prevent. And if I have diabetes, certainly things that I can do to manage that diabetes. So symptoms, classic symptoms of type 2 diabetes. People will frequently talk about, oh my gosh, I'm so thirsty. They'll describe this extreme thirst as feeling as though they're they have cotton in their mouth. Their mouth is so dry. And when we're thirsty, what do? We drink. So they'll also say, I'm drinking so much fluid. And we know what happens when we drink a lot of fluid. Increased trips to the bathroom. So there's increased urination. People will sometimes say, oh my gosh, I'm getting up 2 or 3 times at night to go to the bathroom. So these can be classic symptoms of type 2 diabetes. Other symptoms can be people complaining about, oh my gosh, I'm so tired. Even though I slept soundly for 8 hours, I get up in the morning and I am bone weary. I'm very, very tired. Sometimes people will share, I am hungry all the time. I finished my breakfast and an hour later, I could eat again. I'm so hungry. And despite eating, they'll say, but you know what? My weight's going down. I'm not even trying and I'm losing some weight. That's not such a good thing. And sometimes people will say, you know, my feet are feeling funny. It feels like I have pins and needles in my feet. All of these can be symptoms of diabetes. But I like to be mindful that sometimes there are no symptoms at all, that people will express great surprise that they are told by their doctor that they have diabetes and they didn't even know it. So again, that diabetes being a silent disease, we need to be mindful of our risk factors and what some symptoms might be. So then the question is, well, how do I know if I have diabetes? And really the ways to know definitively if I have diabetes would be seeing my doctor and getting blood tests done. So the way our doctors would diagnose diabetes would be, one way would be a simple blood test. If we go to the lab and we've been fasting at least 8 hours, nothing to eat or drink other than water, and we have our blood drawn, if our blood glucose, which is the name for blood sugar, if our blood glucose is 126 or higher, that's an indication that I probably have type 2 diabetes. Oftentimes, our doctors will do another blood test called the Hemoglobin A1c. The Hemoglobin A1c is a test that tells us over the past 2 to 3 months what our average blood sugar has been. So a diagnostic criteria is an A1c of 6.5% or higher. So if I have that blood test done and my A1c is 6.5 or higher, that's when the doctor is going to start talking to me about diabetes. And on occasion, we might get a blood test done and we haven't been asked to be fasting. And the blood sugar result in the test is above 200. And I may have symptoms. I may tell my doctor, gosh, I'm tired, really tired. I'm thirsty. I'm urinating frequently. And a blood test with those symptoms, a blood test of 200 or higher with those symptoms, that also is diagnostic of type 2 diabetes. And sometimes our doctors will have us do a glucose tolerance test where we will drink a beverage that's very rich in glucose and 2 hours afterwards have our blood sugar checked. And if the glucose is 200 or higher, that's a diagnosis of type 2 diabetes. So there are many ways that our doctors can determine whether or not we have type 2 diabetes. And I'm just going to go back to, I'm sorry. Excuse the glitch, sorry. We'll talk about some of these tests in a little bit in terms of management. So it's not uncommon for me to hear from people, you know, I feel fine. I don't feel like I'm sick. Why should I take care of this? Why bother taking care of my diabetes? And the reason that we're all asked to manage our diabetes is because of the potential chronic complications that can ensue when we have high blood sugars for a long period of time. So I like to, when I talk to my patients, We talk about sugar being sticky, and probably we all have had an instance where we've gotten syrup or honey or fruit juice on our fingertips, and we feel how tacky that is, how sticky that is. Well, if you think about the glucose in our blood, the sugar in our blood, that's sticky as well. And when it's high for an extended period of time, it is sticking to everything inside our body, and it's causing damage. We don't feel it when it's happening, but it is causing damage. And some of the organs that can be affected by this high sugar include our brain. So there's an increased risk of having a stroke if I have unmanaged diabetes. Also, the blood vessels in my heart can be affected. So I can have a heart attack. The risk of having a heart attack is increased, as well as the risk of congestive heart failure. Diabetes that's unmanaged or poorly managed also increases the risk of kidney disease or diabetic nephropathy. Those high blood sugars can also affect my nerves. So that tingling in our feet that we've just talked about, that can be caused by nerve damage from high blood sugars. Also, I'm sure many of us have heard of people who have needed amputations of toes or feet and sometimes legs. Peripheral arterial disease can also occur when blood sugars are very high for a long period of time. Again, those blood vessels are getting essentially clogged up with that sticky sugar and cholesterol, and that decreases circulation to the tips of our toes. So another reason why we want to make sure that our blood glucose is well managed. And also eye damage. Just as the kidneys have very delicate, fragile blood vessels, our eyes do as well. And so the damage to the very delicate blood vessels in our eyes can cause retinopathy or vision loss. So these are all the chronic complications that can happen if I'm not managing my diabetes. So this answers that question, why bother? So oftentimes when I talk to people, they'll say, well, I know someone who had an amputation, or I have a family member who's on dialysis, and there's almost that feeling of I'm doomed. And I like to really emphasize to everybody that I talk to is no. Well-managed diabetes significantly decreases the risk of things like heart attacks and strokes, amputations, kidney failure, eye disorders. So we do know from decades of research that the better controlled those blood sugars are, the better managed my diabetes is, the greater is the reduction in the chance that I'm going to have any of these diabetes complications. That is why we bother with this. And it can be very challenging because, again, there are no significant symptoms necessarily that my blood sugar is too high. So it's easy to ignore, easy to say, well, I'll just skip my physical activity today. Or, well, I'll just have that big piece of cake today because I don't feel any differently. But what we're trying to do is manage those blood sugars so we reduce the risk of these chronic complications. So how do I do that? What are the ingredients for management? So the 5 points that I wanted to bring out this morning. Making healthy food choices, very important to managing our blood sugars. Being physically active. If our doctor has prescribed medications, we need to take those medications the way the doctor prescribed them. Monitoring, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. And also, I'm not in this alone. I have my healthcare team, and it really is quite beneficial if I can work with my healthcare team to get my diabetes well managed. So food choices. Usually when I meet someone, this is the question that they first ask. What can I eat? And so I like to be very, very mindful when we're talking about diabetes, type 2 diabetes, that it's not just blood glucose control or blood sugar control. It's actually three things. It's blood glucose control, it's blood cholesterol control, and it's blood pressure control. So I need to eat, in essence, for all three of these things. And that's why when I think about making healthy food choices, I'm not only thinking about carbohydrate, but I'm also thinking about heart-healthy fats and lean protein sources. So let's take a little dive into this nutrient-packed carbs and what that means. A lot of times when I talk to people about diabetes and talk to them about food, I'm unhappy to hear that they haven't been given information about all the foods that contain carbohydrate that affect blood sugar. So most of the time people are able to say, well, I know I shouldn't have soda, and I know I probably shouldn't be eating chips and cookies. And that's true, but then they forget that even nutrient-dense carbohydrates, whole grain breads, whole grain cereals, pasta, rice, all of these very healthy carbs will also raise my blood sugar. Raising my blood sugar, that's their job. My job is to control the portion as well as the kind of carbohydrate. So I want to include these nutrient-packed carbohydrates every day, as much as possible. That doesn't mean I can never have a potato chip again, but what it does mean is I need to think about my choices and make most of my carbs really nutrient-packed carbohydrates or starches. Another group of carbs that sometimes we forget about are fruits. And many times people are surprised when we talk about fruit having carbohydrate that will raise my blood sugar. Frequently people will say, well, I gave up having those cookies in the afternoon and now I'm having a big bowl of fruit. In terms of nutrients, yes, the fruit is going to be a much better choice, but it contains carbohydrate, so it will raise my blood sugar. So again, just as with those nutrient-dense or nutrient-packed starchy carbs, for the nutrient-packed fruit carbs, I need to be mindful. I need to control the amount that I have at one time. On this slide, I did include carbs to limit or avoid a glass of juice. Fruit juice tends to raise blood sugar very, very quickly and very high. So most people I talk to who have type 2 diabetes, we talk about fruit juice as being something to treat a low blood sugar, not as a beverage per se. So for fruit juice lovers, they usually don't like to hear me say this, but it would be better to eat the fruit rather than drink the juice if I'm trying to manage my blood sugars or my blood glucose. And then the last nutrient-dense carbs that I wanted to mention would be dairy, milk and yogurt. Wonderful healthy foods, but they do contain carb. That's the lactose or the milk sugar. So as with any food that contains carbohydrate, these foods will raise my blood sugar as well. Again, that is their job. But what my job is when I drink or eat these foods is to control the amount that I'm eating. So on the right-hand side of the slide, carbs to limit or avoid, you see that frozen yogurt. Many times people will say, oh, I eat yogurt all the time. And it turns out that they're eating frozen yogurt. Well, that's not really yogurt. It's not the kind of yogurt that we're talking about as low in sweets. So it doesn't mean never, but the better choices would be the less processed. So those are the three main carbohydrate groups: the starchy carbs, the fruit carbs, and the milk or dairy carbs. So let's talk about fat right now. I think over the past several decades, we've all been told, don't eat fat, don't eat fat. And I'm hoping everyone in our group has heard the more current and applicable messages, which are eat healthy fats. It's the heart unhealthy fats that we want to avoid. So heart healthy fats, those would include foods like avocado, guacamole, all nuts, nut butters, peanut butter, almond butter, cashew butter, olive oil, canola oil, salad dressing, olives. It would also include mayonnaise. All of these are heart healthy fats. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see the heart unhealthy fats. These are going to be...
Your screen's not being shown. You have to share screen.
Oh, I'm sorry. Has the screen not been shown at all?
No.
Oh, sorry, I thought I had it on share screen. Sorry, everybody. Okay, share screen.
Okay, now it's there. Thank you.
Thank you. And so I'm going to go back. I do apologize. I thought you could see my screen. So I'm just going to very quickly review the heart healthy food choices. We talked about nutrient-packed carbs. We talked about heart healthy fats, which is where we're up to now. So the nutrient-packed carbs, whole grain breads, cereals, unprocessed grains, rice, oats. We talked about fruit, nutrient-dense carbs, but still containing carbohydrates, so they will increase my blood sugar. And then we talked about nutrient-packed carbs in the form of milk and yogurt. So these are all wonderful, healthy choices, but if a food contains carbohydrate, it is going to raise my blood sugar. That's its job. Let's talk about how to help it with its job. And we were talking about heart healthy fats. So heart healthy fats on the right side of this, on the left side of the screen, you can see avocado, nuts, butters, olives, olive oil. These are all good heart healthy fats. These are things that we want to include every time we eat, at every meal, at every snack. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see the unhealthy fats. These are fats that tend to be solid at room temperature. Butter, if you think about bacon before it's cooked, that white fat that's solid. The fat that's marbled in meat. These are saturated fats. They won't raise my blood sugar, but they are going to raise my blood cholesterol. And we know that with diabetes, it's sugar, cholesterol, blood pressure. So I want to make sure that I limit these greatly and really concentrate on the heart healthy fats. So the reason that we make the recommendation, include some heart healthy fat every time we eat. As an example, if we eat a piece of fruit, and when I think about portions of things like fruit, potato, rice, noodles, pasta, I think about the size of a fist. So if you make a fist, a piece of fruit, a good portion should be about the size of your fist. A portion of pasta, about the size of your fist. A potato, sweet potato, white potato, about the size of your fist. So if we eat carbohydrate all by itself, our blood sugar will pop up. If we eat that carbohydrate and we have a little bit of heart healthy fat, it's going to temper the rise in blood sugar. It's going to cause that blood sugar not to spike as much. An example, let's say we eat a piece of fruit, an apple. And even if it's a reasonable size, that apple all by itself is going to spike my blood sugar. If I have that apple, then maybe I'll have a little bit of peanut butter with it. That peanut butter is heart healthy, and it is going to decrease how high my blood sugar goes. If I'm having oatmeal, and most of us would think of oatmeal as being a very healthy food, and it is, but it is a carb because it's grain. So if I eat plain oatmeal, my blood sugar is going to go up. If I eat oatmeal and I throw some nuts into it, those nuts are going to temper the rise in blood sugar after I eat. That's what we're trying to do to manage our blood sugar. So a good rule of thumb, every single meal, every single snack, weave in a little bit of the heart healthy fat. And then the last food group that I wanted to mention, lean protein. So protein, meat, poultry, fish, cheese, eggs, beans, peas, lentils, all good sources of protein. Protein is not going to make my blood sugar go up the way that starches will, the way that fruit will, or milk. So for protein, the issue is more my cholesterol. I want to eat the healthier proteins. So one of my colleagues once said to me, you know, if it flies, if it swims, eat it. If it walks on four legs, let it go most of the time. So on the left-hand side, you can see flies, swims, poultry, fish, and that the meat that's there is very lean. On the left-hand side, you can see how marbled that steak is. That's all saturated fat. So again, won't make my blood sugar go up, but that marbled fat will make my cholesterol go too high. So lean protein, we want to make sure that we include that in every day. So translating those recommendations into an actual meal, I wanted to share this dinner plate real estate. So as you can see, half of that plate is vegetables. And it could, on this particular plate, it's some cooked vegetables, it's a salad, it could be half salad, it could be half cooked vegetables, but the idea is 50% of that dinner plate has vegetables. And then a quarter of that dinner plate is my lean protein. And the last quarter is going to be my starch, whatever that starch is that I choose to use. And somewhere in that meal, I'm going to make sure there is heart healthy fat. That might be the salad dressing, the oil that I put on my salad, or I might finish off those vegetables with some oil and some garlic to pop the taste. But this hopefully will give you an idea of what our dinner plate should look like. If you find that those proportions are significantly different, many of us find that the starch is half the plate and the vegetables are a quarter. Our challenge is slowly but surely change those proportions so more vegetables get on that plate and we reduce our starch a little bit. And you will find that your blood sugars, your blood glucose responds to that beautifully. So we're going to move from the dinner table to putting our sneakers on and being physically active. For blood glucose management, as well as diabetes risk reduction, the recommendation generally is we should be moderately physically active at least 150 minutes each week. So if we talked about being physically active 5 days a week, we're talking about dedicating 30 minutes 5 days a week to moderately intense physical activity. And probably most of us could find that 30 minutes to do that physical activity. And on this little slide, I wanted to show what some of those activities might be. It doesn't have to be a formal exercise program. Those are wonderful, but if you know personally that you're not likely to go to a gym, then the challenge is find a physical activity that you can commit to. Find a number of activities that you enjoy. Bring family along. Team up with a friend or a colleague, but the idea is to move. And the reason why this physical activity is so helpful for type 2 diabetes, it has, I'd like to think of the two effects that it has, because it has multiple effects, but one effect is the acute effect. If I measured my blood sugar before and after a walk, I would see my blood sugar coming down. So that physical activity will reduce my blood sugar because it uses that glucose, that sugar, as my gasoline. That's my energy source. So I'm using up the glucose and my blood sugar is decreasing. The long-term or chronic effect of physical activity is physical activity helps my body use my insulin better. Frequently, we see in type 2 diabetes, an individual is making more than enough insulin. Sometimes they're making too much insulin, but their body is resistant to it. So by increasing movement, my tissues, my muscle becomes much more sensitive to that insulin. I use it better, and that brings down my blood glucose as well. So the short-term effect of physical activity, before and after that physical activity, my blood sugar is going down. The long-term effect is I use my insulin much more effectively, and that helps control my blood sugar in the long run. So we talked, I'm just going to mention this briefly, taking medications. It is very, very common for people who have diabetes to be on multiple medications for their diabetes management. And that's because there are many different classes or categories of diabetes medications that all work differently. And it's important to take the medication as prescribed. I've had people over the years tell me that, well, I was taking my medication and I didn't feel any differently, so I just stopped. So just as we said, diabetes doesn't have significant symptoms. Having blood sugars that are well managed, we may not feel significantly different. It's only by measuring our sugar that we'll know whether or not those medications are working. Some people have also told me that, well, I have some side effects from my medication. If you're having side effects, it is imperative that you circle back to your doctor who prescribed that medication to discuss those side effects, because there are often ways to get around those side effects, minimize them, get rid of them. I also purposely included in this slide a syringe, because many times people will say, oh, I don't want to take insulin. That means my diabetes is really, really bad. That is not the case. Many people who have diabetes over many years, they'll go on to require insulin because our body changes over time. And sometimes our body no longer responds to the pills, to the oral medications, and then injectable medications are needed. While I've never had anyone volunteer to take an injectable medication, sometimes that's going to be the best medication to manage my diabetes. Monitoring. So we talked about very briefly taking our medications. If we have side effects, we need to circle back to our doctor and talk about those side effects. We don't want to stop taking our medication unless our doctor tells us to stop taking them. And then how do I know if the medication, if my food choices, if my physical activity is working for me? So there are different ways that we monitor how well our diabetes is managed. So these 4 things we'll talk about in a minute. Home glucose monitoring, where I will check my blood sugar at home. We talked a little bit about the hemoglobin A1c. Measuring my blood lipids, so the cholesterol panel that our doctor will run, and also blood pressure. So these are things that should be monitored, and the frequency of monitoring is going to vary from person to person. But let's first talk about home blood glucose monitoring. This is where we prick our finger, and using a machine, a glucose meter, we'll apply a drop of blood to a test strip that goes into the meter, and we'll get a blood sugar result on that meter in 5 to 10 seconds, depending on the meter that we use. And it does involve pricking our finger, so there is an ouch involved. Generally, we can set the lancing device so that it is as comfortable as possible, but we do have to prick our finger. And I've never met anyone who said, oh, I love pricking my finger, because it's not a lot of fun to do. But the reason that people are asked to monitor their blood sugar at home is it tells you and your doctor, is my medicine working for me? Is my food, are my food choices working for me? Is my physical activity working for me? It is not a report card on how good or bad I'm doing. No, no, no. It is a way to assess, is my plan working for me? Because if my plan isn't working for me, I have to change it with my doctor. So in monitoring, the home glucose monitoring frequency really depends on the individual and the medications that they're taking. So I'm going to ask everyone listening, please circle back to your doctor and have this conversation. When should I monitor my blood sugar? How often should I monitor my blood sugar? And I have found that frequently people are monitoring, but they don't know what to look for. So at the bottom of this slide, I have the targets. These are the American Diabetes Association targets. If I'm testing first thing in the morning, fasting, or sometimes my doctor might ask me to test before I eat, my target is going to be between 80 and 130. Sometimes I will ask my patients to test 2 hours after that first bite of a meal, because that's going to help tell us, did that meal work for me? So when I test 2 hours after eating, the target no higher than 140 to 180. And again, that can help me figure out, is this meal working for me? So these are targets from the American Diabetes Association. And just as I'm asking everyone to circle back to your doctor about when to test, how often to test, review these targets with your doctor as well, because your doctor may want you to have slightly different targets. So it's always important to review this in every single visit. Bring with you what your blood sugars have been running. So write it down and review it with your doctor. Again, it's to help assess, is my plan working for me? Another monitoring test is the hemoglobin A1c. And we talked about this as a diagnostic test, but we also look at it to see how well am I doing. The hemoglobin A1c reflects my average blood glucose over the past 2 to 3 months. So it's a test that my doctor will order every 3 months. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see this little thermometer. And I like to give this. In fact, we give this to our patients who are admitted to the hospital when they come in to visit us and they have diabetes, so that they can see what their A1c is. And we point out that the A1c, the target, should be less than 7. So you see where it says in control in green. We would love to see the A1c in that area or a little bit lower. When we see individuals come into the hospital and their A1c is above 12, then seeing a chart like this gives them a better sense of where are they on that management continuum. So it just broadens their vision of how well their diabetes is being managed. Also monitoring blood lipids, so blood cholesterol, the bad cholesterol, LDL, triglycerides, the good cholesterol, HDL. This is generally checked every 3 months with our doctor as well. And blood pressure, every visit to the doctor, we want to get our blood pressure measured. And the results for the blood cholesterol, for the blood pressure, we should ask our doctor, what are those numbers? And we should keep track of those numbers. So I can see our time is almost up, so I wanted to just finish and then allow some time for some questions if there are any. So at the beginning, I mentioned we don't have to go on this journey by ourselves, because it can be very challenging to be on this journey. So I always like to talk to my patients that I see about following up with their primary care doctor, their internist. And with many, many people who have diabetes, that's the doctor with whom they're managing their diabetes. So it's important to continue that open dialogue with our doctor. Many people also see an endocrinologist, who is a doctor who specializes in disorders such as diabetes. So our endocrinologist and our primary care doctor, they work together to help us manage our diabetes. A group that I think doesn't get enough attention and utilized enough are our certified diabetes care and management specialists. These used to be called certified diabetes educators. These diabetes care and management specialists can be nurses, dietitians, exercise physiologists, pharmacists. These are individuals who have a specialty in helping us manage the day-to-day routines in diabetes, so that in between those visits to our doctors, these are the folks that we call to say, you know what, I've noticed that my blood sugar in the morning is trending too high. Can we talk about that? Or who will say, you know, I'm having problems getting my diabetes supplies. Can you help me figure out how to manage this better? And then the last group that I wanted to mention are registered dietitians and nutritionists. And I'm very prejudiced about that group because I am one. So we also can benefit by sitting down with a dietitian nutritionist who will sit with us and talk about, well, what's important to you? What is what are your food habits like? What's working for you? What's not working for you? And help you formulate a plan, fine-tune a plan to help manage that blood sugar even better. So I'm going to challenge everybody to follow up with these different healthcare team members, because they will make this journey much easier. I wanted to mention resources, local resources. Our Greenwich Hospital Center for Behavioral and Nutritional Health. We have a diabetes self-management education program with certified diabetes care and education management specialists, and also medical nutrition therapy. We have those same services at our Greenwich Hospital Outpatient Center, and also the Greenwich Department of Health. Wonderful, wonderful resources in our community. And I apologize if I've missed any resources that are out there, because I know that there are quite a few. And so just to finish up, going back to that question, why bother? Why am I bothering? I don't have symptoms, I'm feeling okay right now. The reason that we bother to manage our diabetes is for not only ourselves and to remain strong and healthy, but also for our family, our relatives, our friends. This is why we manage our diabetes. So I think I probably talked too much, and let me see if there are some questions. Oh, okay. So one question. Nancy, I have type 2 diabetes. My morning blood sugar is always high, the 150s to 180s. I've tried taking small, light protein or fat snacks before bed, peanut butter, a piece of cheese, yogurt, as was suggested, but this has not helped. Do you have any suggestions? It's a wonderful question. Couple of thoughts. One of the things that I think of when I look at morning blood sugars, what are the medications that I'm taking? So if I'm taking a medication such as metformin, I might talk to my doctor about, should that be more heavily weighted in the evening than during the day? That is not a change I would make on my own, but I would talk to my doctor about that. If somebody is using insulin at night, so a 24-hour insulin, there are two things that I would look at. The first thing would be, is it too much insulin? So sometimes when my insulin dose, my 24-hour insulin dose, like Lantus, Levemir, Basaglar, if that's too high, sometimes I'll have a low blood sugar in the middle of the night, might not even wake me up. But because my blood sugar has gone too low, I will rebound in the morning and I'll wake up with a blood sugar that's higher than I want it to be, higher than my target. So sometimes it's too much of that basal insulin, Lantus, Levemir, Basaglar. Sometimes it's not too much. It's not enough. So the way to figure out, is it because it's the dose is too high or the dose is too little, is because I'm not very nice. I'll ask my patients, set an alarm clock for 3 a.m. Wake up and do a finger stick and see what your blood sugar is. If your blood sugar is low, that means the next morning you call your doctor and report this and ask, should I decrease my dose of insulin? If my blood sugar is high at 3 a.m., I call the doctor the next day and say, my blood sugar is high. I think I need a little bit of an insulin adjustment. But again, do not adjust any medications without talking to your doctor first. Also, the snack that you're having sounds fine. You might try not having a snack and seeing if that helps. And sometimes people do a little, very light physical activity before bedtime. And I really mean light. Sometimes people will just sit in a comfortable chair and do some arm rolls, gentle arm rolls. And as silly as that sounds, sometimes that can help get that fasting blood sugar down. Another question, are the Greek yogurts preferable to other types of yogurt? A wonderful question. I tend to recommend a yogurt that has a little bit more protein and a little bit less carbohydrate. So Greek yogurts fall into that class because they're drain some of the whey is drained out, so they're a little bit more concentrated. Another class similar to that is Icelandic yogurt, which also is drained a little bit more and has a higher protein intake and less carbohydrate. Again, if I'm having yogurt, I want to make sure somebody else hasn't added a lot of sugar to it, because sometimes yogurts, they have essentially jelly added to them. So they have a lot of added sugar. So those are types of yogurts that I would the Greek, the Icelandic tend to be good choices. So a question, can I send the slides? Yes, because I think my fabulous IT person, Al, is going to send me, who was on this, so I can send you slides if you would like. And I have a little reminder to mention COVID. So probably all of us have heard the reports that people who have diabetes, higher risk of getting COVID, and outcomes tend to be worse. Again, I want to really emphasize, well-managed diabetes does not translate into a bad outcome with COVID. What we have seen here and what's been reported in the literature, uncontrolled diabetes, greater chance of a very significant COVID experience. So again, another reason why we want to make sure that in addition to all of the good things we're doing now, washing our hands, social distancing, wearing those masks while we're out, we want to make sure we manage our health, we manage our diabetes. I'm looking at okay, so one last question, I think. How do you know whether your bloating is a nuisance or a sign of something more worrisome? That is a great question, and I apologize, I'm probably not the best person to ask that question but what I would recommend is, if you're worried about bloating, the first thing that I would do is contact my primary care doctor and discuss this, and discuss what possible causes there might be. Are there any things that I can do to reduce this? And sometimes it involves working with a gastroenterologist if there's not an evident cause, like some lactose intolerance or some other food intolerance. But the first step would be talk to your doctor about this first, and see if there's anything that should be pursued medically. And the last question, is stress a risk? Is stress a risk of developing type 2 diabetes? There's some evidence that maybe chronic long-term stress can play a role. Somewhat hard to do those studies because it's hard to measure stress. What might be stressful for one person might not be as stressful for another, but there certainly is some concern that chronic stress can increase the risk of systemic inflammation, which is a risk factor for not only developing insulin resistance, prediabetes and diabetes, but also heart disease and high blood pressure. So I think, one more question, and I hope we're okay with the time. Can diabetes cause rapid weight gain or bloating? So, diabetes in and of itself cannot cause rapid weight gain, but what I have seen is when people have diabetes, that is not, their blood sugars are running too high, and when their blood sugars now are better managed, sometimes there will be a little blip in weight, because instead of losing that extra glucose, those calories through our kidneys, we're actually using those calories. So as my blood sugar is getting into my target and staying into my target, initially some people will find that their weight goes up a little bit. That's a temporary thing. The reason it was low was because those calories weren't being utilized, and I was literally losing those from my kidneys in my urine. That's not a good thing. But I will say, if somebody is experiencing an increase in weight, and they're managing their diabetes, I would first talk to my doctor, my primary care doctor. If I'm seeing an endocrinologist, I'd talk to my endocrinologist. Sometimes it's the medication, and that might be changeable. Sometimes it's the foods that I'm eating. So that's when I would want to talk to my registered dietitian nutritionist to look at, I think I'm eating well. Are there any ways that I can fine tune this? So, one more question. What are weekly shots to control type 2 diabetes? So probably many of us have seen advertisements for medications, injectable medications, that the advertisements say that this is not insulin. So this is a class of medications called the GLP-1 antagonist receptors. And these are medications that are not insulin, but they have many positive impacts on controlling blood sugar, blood glucose, by helping our body use insulin better and so on. So there are some that are daily, some injections are daily in this class, and some injections are once a week. And again, if someone, this in the medicine cabinet that our doctors have for helping us control or manage our diabetes, this might be one of the tools that could be offered. And it is a good medication. But again, that's a discussion with my doctor, because I need to discuss with my doctor the pros and cons, the potential benefits and side effects, and also my personal preferences. I've met people who, they don't care if they have to inject things, and other people who tell me they're frightened to death of needles. So need to work with our doctor, need to work with our healthcare team. So I think I have run out of time. I greatly appreciate you all being here. Oh, I'm getting a flash, 20. Okay. It's 10 o'clock, so I think we've run out of time. I so appreciate all of you being here and being part of this. And thank you for your wonderful questions. This has been recorded, so it will be available online. I'm not sure of what the time frame will be, but it will be available. And I hope to hear that you are all doing well, managing your diabetes, bringing your healthcare team along on this wonderful journey. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful day.